Hello everybody, this is FDV Vladerag here to bring you another episode of That's IMBA, where I show you how to deal with units that make you mad. Today we're going to be looking at the Mutalisk, which of course drives everybody insane ever since the buff in HOTS. With its move speed of 4 and tissue regeneration, the Mutalisk can become a real hassle to deal with nowadays, especially if you didn't open up if you didn't scout the Mutalisks, they can just all of a sudden hit you really hard, destroy your mineral line, and you know what, let's just prevent that from happening. So here is how we deal with Mutalisks. We're going to start out by saying, how does the Terran deal with Mutalisk? We're going to get 3 Mutalisks, I think, right now for this demonstration here, and let's just match it in minerals, or, oops, did I always end up getting one too many, and then it never wants to delete properly. Never does. Darn, I'll just clear it. Wow, I really should do another take, but let's just go forward and pretend I didn't mess up. Anyway, these guys don't actually have stim either, and the gas is sort of expensive. Here is the deal. When you are playing as Terran, one of the best ways to deal with Mutalisks is the Marine.
Yes, sir.
These don't have stim, of course, so it becomes a little bit of an issue, but if you'll just watch, yeah. See? They barely even do any damage whatsoever.
Sure.
It's true, of course, that I did add the medevac and a couple extra Marines, but if you take a look at this, they have still 300 gas on their side, and it's 600 total, and gas is even more expensive, so it's much more likely and easier for you to have this than for them to have this. It's also a lot more costly if they lose this than if you lose this. I mean, you can expect to lose this and not really have too much of an issue, and if we were to... Sorry, people, it's sort of sad that I'm actually having this trouble, but if we do this, and we add, let's just say, this many muta here, so there's actually more supply and more resources on their side than on ours, and of course my mouse freezes.
You got it.
And then as you can see, the Mutalisks are just being slaughtered. I'm not even microing this at all. This entire engagement could have been even more taken care of by focusing down the Mutalisks, but a Marine with stim is more than capable of handling this himself, or themselves rather, and as you'll notice, the medevac, of course, is cleaning them all up. And my mount, there we go, got that back. Notice the Marine move speed is only 2.25, but if we were to stim, the move speed then becomes 3.37. Not quite enough to catch a Mutalisk, but more than enough to get to you to where you need to be and put a little pressure on them. To put it one way, they become faster than a stalker. Anyways, now, assuming that you didn't open up... I'm just going to have to do that. Assuming that you didn't open up going for bio play, your other option is the Thor, basically, for the mech style player coming out of your factory. Now the thing about the Thor is that it has a lot of health, and even better yet, it has a huge amount of DPS with its javelin missile launchers. They do extra damage versus air, they have an incredible range, and they deal splash damage. So I'm just not going to be dealing too much splash damage here, but, or is it? That's actually sort of funny that it's not. Let's see if I can hit it and get some splash damage. Now, wow, so I messed that up myself. Here, there is a point I'm trying to make here that is about what happens when there you go, there's the splash damage. As you noticed, 5 Mutalisks here were enough to take this down if they were spaced correctly. Now that is one of the weaknesses, one I actually wanted to address later in this little thing, not to have that example first. But the weakness of Thors. And the strength of Thors is their splash damage, and the weakness of Thors is their splash damage. If you have an opponent who does not know how to micro his Mutalisk correctly, a Thor can destroy them all. Sorry about that, everyone. Just completely had to disappear there for a second. I am back. As I was saying, Mutalisks, if microed correctly, can easily take out a Thor because they will not take the splash damage. However, if they are not micro, if you can get them to go into this ball, which is something that Mutalisks tend to do when they turn quickly, all of a sudden the Thor does a lot of damage to them. Also, of course, Thors have the advantage of being able to be repaired. Just remember, though, you never want it to be like this, where it's only shooting one Mutalisk at a time. Anyway, gonna reset that, bring this all back. There are even more options. To be perfectly honest, Terran has the best option for dealing with Mutalisks of any race. Even this, now this is something I wouldn't suggest doing, but I will like to point out that Mutalisks lose one-on-one to Vikings. They actually even lose in groups. Vikings are more than strong enough. Well, basically they endure long enough to kill Mutalisks. The reason Mutalisks are considered a counter to Vikings is because Mutalisks are very fast and they regenerate, meaning that a Mutalisk player can jump in, jump out, hit there, hit everywhere, and basically force your much slower Vikings to go all around. So you really would prefer to counter with either things with extremely long range and splash damage, like the Thor, or things that can move quickly, like the Marine. Now, in a straight-up battle, the other things you can use are the Battlecruiser, which do very well versus Mutalisks. I won't actually illustrate the point here, but they do very well. And Widow Mines. A note on Widow Mines is that they are often very hit and miss, and I mean that quite literally. Basically, you can either kill all of their Mutalisks with just 2 Widow Mine hits, or you could have a dozen and kill 1 or 2. It really is sort of random like that because you can't control where it's shooting. It shoots at basically the first one it gets a lock on. Even more than that, because of the speed of Mutalisks, one of the things not often talked about about Widow Mines is that they have a weakness. They have an effective range that is actually smaller than their listed range. Widow Mine has, I believe, a range of 5 or 4? 5. But its effective range is smaller than that because it takes a certain amount of time to lock on, meaning that if you have speedlings on creep, for example, with a movement speed of over 5, the effective range of a Widow Mine is actually something like 3. In other words, they need to be able to get basically within 3 hexes of a Widow Mine before a Widow Mine can hit them. So if they move through a Widow Mine sphere of targeting, anywhere larger than that 3, they'll be fine. Mutalisks, I think it's like 4.2 or something like that, meaning that basically you need Widow Mines to have, their borders have to be closer together than you would think for them to hit Mutalisks all the time. Other things, Ravens do very well. To be honest, Terran has the most ability to deal with Mutalisks. The only problem with Ravens, of course, is that they are slow. This is why Marines and missile turrets are much more common to see than basically any of the other options you can use, because you have to deal with the Mutalisk speed. One note about Terrans is it often makes a lot of sense to put missile turrets up, not even to kill the Mutalisks, but just to distract them while you can get your Marines into position. Now Zerg. Dealing with Mutalisks can be much more interesting as Zerg. There's sort of 2 ways to go about it. One is just to make Mutalisks. Mutalisk versus Mutalisk play was very common before they buffed Spore Crawlers. To that point, if you are not going for Mutalisk, Spore Crawlers are amazing versus Mutalisks. They will kill Mutalisk in 3 hits, and they have 4 times the amount of health as a Mutalisk does, and they shoot faster too. 1 Spore Crawler will slaughter so many Mutalisk, I can't even describe it to you. Of course, they're mobile, but they're not nearly as mobile as a Mutalisk, so you have to be careful of that. Now, when we actually talk about fighting what with what, the counter for the Mutalisk in a straight-up battle is the Hydralisk. Now, do you see the problem with the Hydralisk is that it is fragile. It's as fragile as the Mutalisk, really, even a little more fragile. It just has a higher DPS. So we don't want our Hydralisks to get too separated from each other. We need them to stick together. And the other problem is they're quite slow off creep. Well, this one, because it has all the upgrades on, has a 2.81 movement speed. But remember that the Mutalisk has a 4, so it can be very difficult to deal with them. Basically, when you fight a Mutalisk player, you want to force them. When you fight a Mutalisk player and you're a Roach Hydra player, you want to force them into a situation they don't want to. Whoa, that person is loud bass. I don't know if anybody could hear that. Somebody just drove by with the loudest bass I've ever heard. You want to force your opponent into a position that they can't deal with. You want to make them have to use their units to defend. A Mutalisk player does not want to fight you. They want to hurt you, but not fight you. The difference is they basically don't want to risk their Mutalisks, because Mutalisks are fragile. Roach Hydra will win straight up versus Mutaling. Now, the other final option is the Corruptor. Amazingly, Corruptors actually do fairly well versus Mutalisks. Long story short, they basically just outlast them. It's sort of surprising, but they do okay. That's basically the most that can be said about this. The problem is, of course, that Corruptors are a bit more expensive. They take a little longer to make. And, of course, they don't shoot down. So you have to be very careful about using Corruptors to counter Mutalisks, but they will do alright. Leaving those three, those will be your 3 sort of common ways to counter Mutalisks. Spore Crawlers, Spore Crawlers, Hydralisks, other Mutalisks, or Corruptors. It's really 3 because the Mutalisk Corruptor are sort of one thing combined. Now, just like Terran, there are slightly less efficient ways to deal with a Mutalisk threat. One would be Infestors. Infested Terrans are amazing versus Mutalisks, but only if the Mutalisks stay put long enough. Of course, there is fungal growth, but that's now a projectile. So, if your micro is good, Infestors will do better than any other unit versus Mutalisks. If your micro isn't so good, you'll just waste all your money. Always remember that. Protoss has the best ways to deal with Mutalisks. The caveat is that if they don't choose the best way to deal with Mutalisks, almost all of the other ways rather suck. Ever since the buff, Blinkstalkers is not really enough anymore to deal with Mutalisk players, simply because you can blink but they can regenerate, so they can just keep coming back over and over and over again and not really lose anything into these engagements while you continue to be whittled away. Now the thing is, theoretically, of course, I'm going just for the sake of argument, Phoenix are the best counter to Mutalisks ever. They can move and shoot, they do extra damage. The movement and shooting, of course, is their best advantage ever. Basically, I can really keep this up forever. There's absolutely no reason, minus my own lack of APM, basically, that I could not kill every one of these Mutalisks. 3 times as many Mutalisks, and it will take them much more APM than me to stop me from killing all of them. Please keep in mind that my APM is only around 30, 40, maybe 50 at the most, and this is extremely easy to do. It's the easiest micro in the game. Anyway, going back here, clearing this off after examining that, remember that Phoenix range is almost a necessity to deal with Mutalisks because they're not that much slower than Phoenix, so you want to get that range. When they have the range, Phoenix have like 7 range, and Mutalisks have like 3, so it really is easy to micro against them. Now, our other options for dealing with Mutalisks are the Archon, which is a lot like the Thor, which means, of course, and I mean when I say a lot like the Thor, this is basically a Protoss Thor. The difference is it does way more damage versus Mutalisks than a Thor does, and it has a slightly larger splash radius than the Thor as well. It does less splash damage, but it has a larger splash radius, meaning it sort of does better versus Mutalisks in general, and of course it has all that extra damage versus biological. The problem with using Archons to fight Mutalisks is that very often it's difficult to move. I mean, they are quite fast with 2.81. They are one of the fastest units in the game, or they're in that faster category at least. But they're massive. so it can be very hard to maneuver them around a base, and they have low range, so they have to be right up close to a Mutalisk to hit them. To combine the two of these, you can't really use Archons for defense, but much like a Roach Hydra player, when you actually go to engage a Mutaling player, Archons are extremely useful, because they will slaughter just basically everything the Zerg has. That is the long and the short of it. Now, as we start to tech up, we want to really limit our Archon and our Phoenix in our army, just because they are less useful. They don't have as high a DPS as some of the others. Normally, Archons are brought into a Protoss army more to tank than to kill. So as we go up, we need to say, well, how do we deal with Mutalisks with our highest tech, our Sky Toss, our 20 Colossus, whatever our choice is. I believe Sky Toss, of course, is the optimal Protoss finishing that late game Mass Void carrier, which is precisely what you want, the carrier. Carriers actually do extremely well versus Mutalisks as well. Of course, you have to watch out for Corruptors, and this does have 8. You'll notice that it just begins to slaughter these. Even if the AI is smart enough to go for the carrier, it really doesn't matter much. Carrier's DPS is the absolute highest of anything in the game, and having a lot of carriers, easily more than enough to kill Mutalisks. You'll even know that this trade here was far better, well, actually it was 450 there, but that's counting interceptors. Basically, it's a bad trade to go Mutalisk to carrier. And that's pretty much it. The other ways that Protoss, the less optimal ways that Protoss would handle Mutalisks would be Blink Stalkers. Sentries can do okay. They use Guardian Shield, and it takes 2 damage, not just off the Mutalisk's first hit, but off of every bounce. So really, it's like it's giving it, a +6 armor almost. It's a very useful benefit to have. It just sort of strips a lot of damage away. But of course, sentries are fragile, stalkers are fragile, Mutalisks regenerate. So basically, these are less optimal, and if you find yourself in a situation like that, you really need to you basically just need to attack your opponent as soon as possible. If you have Blink Stalkers, I just suggest teching up to Archons and going for it, because you just need to attack them. They can't usually defend. That's sort of that is my advice with that. You don't really want to be in a situation where you don't have Phoenix versus Mutalisk, because unlike all the other races, you really want Phoenix. Alright, I think that pretty much covers it. One final thing to note about dealing with Mutalisks as all 3 races, the things that do not handle Mutalisks well. With Terran, it's pretty obvious that nothing that can't shoot up won't help you versus Mutalisk. I just want to make sure everyone's clear, and also Ghosts, despite their snipe, despite their extra damage versus light, are too expensive. Do not try to go Ghost versus Muta. You won't like it. For Zerg, Queens can be effective, but after a while it becomes less useful as Mutalisk count begins to grow, so always be careful about things like that. For Protoss, a lot of people used to suggest using Psionic Storm, but Mutalisks are way faster now. Also, Void Rays do not work versus Mutas. Mutas counter Void Rays. I think I mentioned this in my last That's IMBA episode, but I just want to make sure everybody truly understands this point. Mutalisk versus Void Ray, Mutalisk wins. Always remember that. Anyway, I think that covers it, and this has been FDV.